Mayday.
Mayday, reday, mayday, reday.
Easy forward and right. And swimmer and victim are clear of the water.
The fishing boat Margaret Jane and the ocean trawler Cape Beaver have just collided. The fishing boat is about to sink. Some of these men will be rescued. But 4 will die, sucked down by their own ship. By the time marine investigators arrive at the scene of tragedies like this one, the evidence has usually vanished beneath the sea. A ship in trouble. This is the bulk carrier Gold Bond Conveyor. As big as a cruise liner, she is en route from Canada to Florida with a cargo of gypsum. It's the middle of the night, and the drama is being filmed with an infrared camera. Although the ship is listing badly, no mayday has been sent. The captain doesn't think they are in immediate danger, but a rescue plane circles anxiously overhead. Suddenly, a 100-foot wave crashes over the ship. And that was the last anyone saw of the Gold Bond Conveyor or her 33-man crew. Accident investigators studied this film over and over for an answer to the tragedy, but none was forthcoming. It was a bad storm, but other ships nearby had survived. What had caused this modern, well-equipped vessel to disappear? At the Transportation Safety Board of Canada, investigator John Garstang began to puzzle over the mystery. The 17,000-ton Gold Bond Conveyor was one of a series of bulk carriers with an unusual design feature. It had a cargo door in its stern. To load it, a conveyor belt was extended out through the door and a cargo of grain or minerals placed on it. But what made it sink? Investigators turned to a computer to enhance the last image of the dying ship. The infrared film revealed something unusual about the ship's stern, but investigators couldn't be sure. Then, a stroke of luck. By chance, the plane crew had taken 4 snapshots of their own. The images were enlarged and fed into the computer. The forward hatches all seemed to be secure and in place, but then investigators made a crucial discovery.
We were able to show that the rear door that opens for the conveyor belt was in fact open, and the assembly for the conveyor belt was actually dragging in the water, leaving a wake. And by studying the dimensions of the door arrangement and the height of the door sill, we could show that for that assembly to be dragging in the water was in fact above the level of the door sill, therefore would be free to flow into the vessel itself.
Water had been pouring into the ship through the open door. What made it worse was that the conveyor belt ran the whole length of the ship without any watertight bulkheads. Once water got in, it could flow right through the vessel. The Gold Bond conveyor had been shipping water for hours. So why was the crew unaware of what was happening?
We did a vision analysis. Could from the bridge the crew see that the doors were open near the stern? And based on the imagery we had, studying view angles, our determination was no, they couldn't see that. Due to the situation where they could see their bow slowly sinking and then taking on water too, the crew may have perceived that the problem was in fact forward, not aft.
The mystery was solved. The Gold Bond conveyor was sunk by nothing more complicated than an open door. But not all cases respond so easily to the tools of the investigators. The summer of 1958, at the Great Lakes Engineering Works in River Rouge, Michigan, Hull 301 was being prepared for launch and naming. Many of those present had helped to build the mighty 729-foot ship. Now, as they watched, she was given a real name, one they were sure would resound across the Great Lakes. And resound it did. On the 8th of June, 1958, Hull 301 was christened the Edmund Fitzgerald. On November 9th, 1975, the Edmund Fitzgerald was in Superior, Wisconsin, loading taconite, a refined iron ore. Ernest McSorley had only assumed command of the Edmund Fitzgerald 3 years earlier in 1972, but he was a 40-year veteran of the Great Lakes. Like all oreboat captains, he knew how deceptive the lakes could be, changing from benign calm to boiling malevolence in a matter of hours, with November the most fickle month of all. If you spent your life on the lakes, survival depended on your ability to read the weather.
We live by the weather. Everything's dictated by the weather. Where we go, fog, rain, sleet, snow. Our whole life is nothing but weather.
Captain Dudley Paquette's boat, the Wilfred Sykes, had been loading at the ore dock at the same time as the Edmund Fitzgerald. As the Fitzgerald left Superior in the sunshine with the Wilfred Sykes in her wake, a warning was issued by the National Weather Bureau in Chicago. An area of unusual low pressure was moving north from the Texas Panhandle. At the same time, a bitter cold front was heading east from Canada. The two were projected to meet over Lake Superior.
Here's what's scary. Here's what's frightening.
Lake veterans like Jerry Lawson and Dudley Paquette are no strangers to extreme weather. But looking at that night's meteorological maps for the first time in 2 decades still fills them with a sense of awe.
Boy, now she's wind up. Holy smokes, look at that son of a bitch there, will you?
As the storm wound up, the Fitzgerald now made radio contact with another great freighter, the Arthur M. Anderson. Her captain, Bernie Cooper, was heading south on the same track as the Edmund Fitzgerald. They decided to sail together. The warning signs were ominous. As the sea got rougher, Dudley Paquette made for cover.
It's the worst storm that I've ever experienced. The barometer pressure at 2856 was the lowest ever recorded on the Great Lakes in the history of weather forecasting. So we were in one Jim Dandy of a storm, and I knew it. At 3 o'clock in that morning, I knew it. And I just couldn't believe what I was visually looking at. Now, this is the most frightening picture you'll ever see on a weather chart.
Out in the middle of Lake Superior, the Fitzgerald had forged ahead of the Anderson and was now in the very teeth of the storm. Bernie Cooper, the captain of the Anderson, watched the Fitzgerald on his radar with mounting concern. Cooper has since passed away. He never liked to talk much about what happened that night, but at a social event a few years before his death, he made a rare speech about what has become known as the Fitzgerald Storm. As he told the enthralled gathering, it was at 3:30 that he first knew the ship was in trouble.
They called me up. Excuse me. And he said, I got problems. He said, I got a French wheel down. He said, I got some vents torn off. He said, I've got a bad list. And I said, you got your pumps going? He said, yeah. And he said, will you shadow me so that you can overtake me? I said, okay, we'll do our best.
Already sailing with a list, the Fitzgerald now lost its radar. Her captain was effectively blind and relying completely on Bernie Cooper to check his position and tell him where he was. But a snow squall obliterated the Anderson's radar screen. When it cleared, Cooper could no longer see the Fitzgerald.
About 7:30, it cleared up. You can see it for miles. And we can see these three ships about 17 miles away coming up out of the bay. And I'm turned on the main. I said, where's the Fitzgerald?
In other news today, an air and sea search is continuing for possible survivors at the Edmund Fitzgerald, a 729-foot ore carrier, which apparently broke apart and sank last night on Lake Superior. The ship and its 29-man crew vanished in a storm with 80-mile-an-hour winds and wave heights of up to 25 feet. All that has been found is an oil slick and some debris.
The whole area was just saturated with this fuel oil. We were encircled in this black mud, which it looked like. We knew then for sure that the Edmund Fitzgerald was down on the bottom.
The loss of the Edmund Fitzgerald was shocking enough. But in the wake of the tragedy, the investigation would take an even more dramatic turn. The Edmund Fitzgerald had vanished in a violent storm. In the aftermath, investigators had no clues and little to go on.
The ideal thing on an investigation is take all your evidence, put it together, and it gives you the conclusion. Unfortunately, in the ship business, as differing from aircraft, in aircraft, what goes up must come down, and you can pick up the pieces and look at them. In the ship business, what goes down seldom comes up. And so you only get some of the pieces. But no one really had a clue. It just disappeared without a trace.
Coast Guard Commander Jim Wilson was part of the Marine Board appointed to find out why the Fitzgerald had sunk.
When we finished the testimony phase of the Marine Board, we then had a meeting, and everyone was pretty upset because we didn't feel we knew any more than we did before. In the discussion, we said, well, we talked to everyone that could know anything about this. And it dawned on me at the time that we'd missed somebody very important. My comment was, no, we have not spoken to the hulk of the vessel.
The ship lay broken in 500 feet of water. Investigators hoped that somewhere in the torn and mangled wreck were the clues that would solve the mystery of the Edmund Fitzgerald. One theory was that the ship had been weakened structurally by 17 years of hard labor.
A lake freighter normally works from 2/3 from forward and 1 from third aft. We refer to that as the hinge. They work like this. When they hit big seas, if you're hitting them too hard, they work. And we call that the hinge. You do this for 17 years and something's going to break.
Had years of twisting and straining in heavy seas finally taken their toll? Photographs taken of the wreck would tell a different tale.
If the vessel had fractured on the surface, whether it broke apart completely or had a fracture in it, we would have found a sign of brittle fracture. And brittle fracture is basically a straight line, almost as though you took a pair of shears and cut right through the metal. Tin snips are shears, and you get a straight line. We looked for that, but we couldn't find it. What we found were ductile tears. That's a ductile tear, and that's caused by the crash damage when the vessel hit the bottom. Here you can see just the massive damage done to the steel plating. This is all ductile failure. The implication of that is that the vessel, those fractures did not take place on the surface, but they came when the vessel struck the bottom.
So the ship hadn't broken up on the surface. Investigators now focused on the course the Edmund Fitzgerald was steering. Her last voyage had taken her through perilous waters. The islands of Michipicoten and Caribou are notorious for the submerged reefs that clustered around their shores. Midway between the two is an infamous spot known as Chummy Bank. Investigators felt sure they were onto something. The Fitzgerald had come through this very spot just before she reported she had taken on a list. Bernie Cooper on the Anderson thought she might have struck underwater rocks there. But a close reading of the charts revealed something peculiar. The U.S.-Canadian border runs through the center of Lake Superior, so there are two charts, one Canadian and one American. Because the Fitzgerald and the Anderson were American ships, they were using the American charts.
This is the chart that was in existence at the time of the loss of the Edmund Fitzgerald. It's a chart prepared by the U.S. government, Lake Survey, for Lake Superior. On this chart, on the day of the loss, the Fitzgerald was at Michipicoten West End when he made the turn for whitefish. He came down near the area of Chummy Bank, which is shown here on the U.S. chart. And Chummy Bank is a shallower area and shows a 6 and 9 fathom spot on Chummy Bank. So one of the questions we had is, did he cross over that spot as Captain Cooper thought he might have and had done some damage?
The original survey of Chummy Bank had been done by the Canadians, since it was on their side of the border, and the Americans had simply copied the Canadian figures onto their charts. They marked the depth as 6 fathoms, or 36 feet, a serious hazard to big ships. But in doing so, they made a mistake.
What they found was that this 6-fathom shoal does not exist at that point. It was, or it never did exist on the Canadian charts, because this is the Canadian chart. And if you look up in the same area, you can see this is Chummy Bank, same name. But the area that was noted on the American chart as being a 6-fathom shoal is actually 10 on the Canadian chart.
The 1 of the 10 was mistaken for a contour line and was omitted. Another stray contour line turned the 0 into a 6. So a comfortable 10 fathoms became a deadly 6, and the lethal, if bogus, legend of Chummy Bank was born.
So it's a transcription error. So Captain Cooper's worry about Captain McSorley getting over the 6-fathom bank may have been a worry, but it wasn't a real problem.
Chummy Bank had been no more than a huge red herring. Investigators were back at square one. What had sent the Edmund Fitzgerald to the bottom of the lake on that terrible November night? The underwater video would reveal the answer to the mystery.
As we go further down in the photos, we find something of great interest. This is something we didn't anticipate finding, and that is the condition of the hatch clamps. When we found these hatch clamps, we suddenly realized that we had come upon a valuable piece of evidence. 3 members of the van, almost in unison, made the same expletive, which we'll delete here, but it was essentially Eureka, we have found it.
The Edmund Fitzgerald had a series of 22 hatches running along the length of her deck. It was through these that her taconite cargo was loaded at the ore docks, all 26,000 tons of it. Once loaded, these hatches would be closed and made watertight with steel clamps. From the position of the wreckage on the seabed, Jim Wilson knew that the Fitzgerald had turned over as she went down. This left the hatch covers to take the weight of those 26,000 tons of taconite. Her hatches had been blown off. What Jim Wilson also knew was that as the hatches came off, all the hatch clamps should have been badly damaged. But some of them weren't.
Many of the hatch clamps were off the covers and undamaged. We can see we have two clamps here that are in good shape, but here we have one that's distorted. It's been stretched out. But these were not, and they came off without any undue stress. That would indicate they were not tight on the hatch cover. They should have been damaged when the cover came off. The implication is that only a few of the clamps were holding the hatch cover on in place. The remainder were loose, not properly tightened. That meant that the gasket where those were loose was not tight against the coaming, and water could enter.
During the storm, waves were breaking over the Edmund Fitzgerald's deck. Investigators now believe that the hatch covers had not been battened down properly. Water was pouring in on the seaward side, and the taconite pellets were soaking it up like a sponge, causing the ship to list. Finally, it capsized and sank. For 17 years, the Edmund Fitzgerald had roamed the Great Lakes. A legend in her own time, turning heads wherever she went. But legends die hard. Even now, there are those who refuse to believe a simple hatch cover sunk the mighty ship. For the investigators, the case is closed. But on the other side of the Atlantic, a bitter debate would cloud the outcome of one of the worst disasters in Europe's maritime history.
Mayday, 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 mayday.
Passenger ferries are fast, cheap, and convenient. Travelers trust they are safe and well maintained, but that's not always the case. The bustling port city of Tallinn on the Baltic Sea is the capital of Estonia. In 1994, after years of Soviet rule, the newly independent nation established its own ferry service. The 3,000-ton luxury passenger ferry Estonia was the flagship of its fleet, sailing across the Baltic Sea between Tallinn and Stockholm, Sweden. Senior officers loved to show passengers around the ship. On one such tour in June 1994, a Swedish tourist posed a question that would prove to be eerily prophetic.
How long do you imagine a human being could survive in the water?
In life, why in the water? Why in the water? Can you tell me why in the water?
You know,
I don't understand why in the water. If we are in lifeboats and life vests.
Just 3 months later, this officer and all his colleagues on the bridge would lose their lives in the frigid waters of the Baltic Sea. September 27th, 1994 was cold and blustery. The crossing that night threatened to be rough, particularly after midnight when the ferry would be in the open sea. Among the passengers was Mikael Owen, a Swedish engineer returning to Stockholm. 3 hours into the journey, he was feeling seasick and went to bed. But just after 1 o'clock in the morning, he was awakened by the ship suddenly heeling over.
I heard 3 very strong banging noises from down or was lying there, I felt that the ship moved in another way. It was like the waves were coming from the side. It was rolling. It was not moving like it did before.
Mikhail Owen decided to leave his cabin and investigate.
I saw people that were not properly dressed, and they were screaming, and it was total panic. So I decided to go up the stairs to the lifeboat deck. And when I reached the top of the stair, the ship suddenly tilted even more. It's about 45 degrees. So when I reached the top, I was stepped out in the air as the ship tilted, and then people were falling towards each other.
Down in the engine room, the crew checked the cameras that scanned the bow door.
I looked at the TV monitor. Water was coming in on both sides of a bow ramp. I thought something must be wrong with the bow.
At 1:24 in the morning, the Estonia sent out a distress call.
Mayday, Mayday. Estonia, what's going on? Can you reply? Joo, meillä on nyt tässä ongelma. On paha kallistuma oikealle puolelle. Uskon, että oli pari 30 astetta. Ja voitko antaa sun positio? Siis meidän pätkit on, meillä on blackout ja emme saa nyt, mä oon joku sanonut, että pitää katsoa.
As the ship heeled over, Paul Barney, an English landscape gardener, sought shelter from the raging gale in a doorway with a fellow passenger from Estonia.
I asked the Estonian how long we'd survive in the water. He told me 4 minutes. I was sort of really faced at that point by my mortality and the fact that someone was actually something was trying to kill me here. And then all of a sudden, I noticed a life belt across this ravine, which was the old promenade deck, which has now turned almost 90 degrees. And I hadn't said anything to the Estonian guy, but we were both looking at this and trying to debate whether it was worth going for it or not. He went for it first, and then all of a sudden the wave came over from the stern and just washed him away.
At 1:27 in the morning, the ferry sent out its last message. Then, silence. Aboard the doomed ship, the crew was trying to launch the life rafts.
We went late in the raft. They sounded the typhoon signal. It's a goodbye from the captain. It means save yourself if you can. There is nothing more we can do. Every man for himself.
The Estonia began to roll over. Soon, the bottom of the ship was the only part still above water. Mikhail Owen clambered onto the upturned keel.
I was looking around, and down on my left side I saw a lot of life rafts. And on the right side, that was the bottom, it was dark. But far away from that, I saw the lights from 2 other ferries. And then as I was sitting there, I remember I had my camera in one pocket.
Mikhail Owen used the flash to try to attract passing ships, while the camera captured the scene on the upturned keel of the Estonia.
And here you can see one man sitting, and you can see that he's wearing 2 life jackets. I took them just before I was swept off and came into the water.
For the passengers sliding into the water, the ordeal was just beginning. The storm was at its height, with 20-foot waves, and the temperature was below zero. Other ferries were soon on the scene and began to rescue those who had managed to get into life rafts. 34 were lucky enough to be picked up before dawn, many suffering from hypothermia and shock. But most were still in the freezing water, or adrift in life rafts that had been swamped. Paul Barney could only watch as those in his raft slowly succumbed to the biting cold.
You knew when people were going to go. Sort of start off with groaning and then throwing themselves around, and then just slipping away. And death was actually the nice place to be. Death was a nice, cosy, warm place. It was a lovely escape from the hell that is living at the time.
By daybreak, dozens of helicopters were in the air. Littering the sea was the debris of death. There seemed little hope of finding survivors.
We noticed that life rafts were drifting in higher speed than life jackets, and life jackets with bodies in it had a slower speed. So Mother Nature sorted out things.
Paul Barney and 13 others had spent the night in this life raft that was upside down and waterlogged. By dawn, only 6 were still alive.
I was in the dead part, what I call the dead zone in the life raft, where people who'd perished early had just drowned in the life raft and been floating around in the life raft. And I began to feel more and more constricted by this, and was sitting actually out on the edge of the life raft, looking out all the time. I didn't want to look inside this human soup.
About 6:30, they heard the distant drone of a helicopter overhead.
First I saw the man in the green sweater, because he was standing up. And then I saw people floating around in the raft. But I saw some face down, but it was a terrible scene.
They were the last survivors to be picked up. Paul Barney's body temperature was so low he was only 1 degree away from death.
Okay.
Others were not so lucky. What began as a rescue mission had turned into a recovery operation. More than 850 people died in Europe's worst ferry disaster ever. In the outcry that followed, the governments of Sweden, Finland, and Estonia promised grieving relatives they would leave no stone unturned to find the cause of the tragedy. But the investigation that followed would be plagued by conflict and controversy. The passenger ferry Estonia had mysteriously plunged into the icy waters of the Baltic, carrying over 800 passengers to their doom. Overwhelmed by the magnitude of the disaster, the prime ministers of Estonia, Finland, and Sweden announced the formation of a joint commission of inquiry.
It's a human tragedy beyond belief, and it is most certainly the worst human disaster that has affected my country for at least a century, probably more.
A search soon located the Estonia in less than 300 feet of water. The 3 governments pledged to raise the ship from the seafloor. Underwater cameras confirmed that it was lying on its side, and its bow door was missing. "16 days later, the door was found 1 mile west of the ship. It was raised and taken to the nearest port, where investigators could study it in detail. Many ferries in the Baltic have bow doors that rise up on hydraulic hinges to allow cars and trucks to drive on and off quickly in port. It was clear that the bow door of the Estonia had come off. The question was, why? The door weighed 55 tons and was hinged at the top and secured by locks at the side and the base. By design, it must be heavy enough to take the full weight of waves at sea, and it must form a watertight barrier, but it also has to be light enough to open easily in port. Investigators used scale models to analyze what forces the storm on the Baltic would have generated. They found that in normal seas, waves hitting the lower part of the door helped keep it shut. But in rough seas, with waves 13 feet high, like those reported on the night of the disaster, hitting the top of the door threatened to force it open. To make matters worse, the bow door, or visor, on the Estonia seemed unusually wide and vulnerable. Investigators then tested the strength of the hinges and locks that secured the door to see how much pressure it would take to break them. They became convinced that the locks would not hold under the impact of 13-foot waves. Based on the tests, investigators for the Commission of Inquiry developed a theory of what had happened to the bow of the Estonia and why the ship sank. As the ferry headed into the storm, heavy waves smashed against the top of the bow, trying to flip the door open. The pressure put a tremendous strain on the locks, which held it in place. First, the side locks gave way. Then the hinges. And finally, the lock at the bottom of the door. The visor hung precariously on the front of the ship before tumbling into the sea, pulling the vehicle ramp down with it. As the water filled the car deck, the Estonia rolled over and sank stern first, with a loss of 852 lives. Sadly, there is no one to confirm this theory. Everyone on the bridge perished in the disaster. But in support of their case, investigators discovered that the locks on the Estonia's sister ship had given way in a storm 2 years earlier. Fortunately, the visor remained in place. In fact, the Commission found 10 cases of broken locks or visors on Baltic ferries. But in each of these cases, the captain had averted disaster by reducing his speed. Only the Estonia failed to slow down. It continued to plow through the heavy seas at 15 knots.
It's crazy that this ship was speeding through waters when all the other ferries were slowing down, through waters when severe conditions, when in fact it wasn't even designed to cope with those conditions.
The bow door of the Estonia, with its dramatic and elegant flair, was the crucial weakness, according to the Commission. It could not stand up to the 20-foot waves which were a common occurrence in the Baltic in winter. In the end, the Commission found that the disaster was the result of a simple design fault. The investigation into the sinking of the Estonia seemed to be over, but in fact, it was just beginning.
When your friends are quite tall, yet there's room for them all, that's amore. When your foot hits the gas and you're off in a flash, that's amore. When a car makes you drool just like pasta fagioli, that's amore. The next Neon, a lot more to love.
All right, Friskies, who's up for some breakfast? Relax, kid, you're not on the menu. Now here's the good stuff. Love that taste. Friskies,
When you buy a bargain basement PC, what you're really buying is a mystery box. Will there be a monitor? Probably not. Lots of software? Ha! A free year on the internet? 24/7 tech support? Dream on. With a Gateway Essential PC, you know exactly what you're getting. Monitor, great software, award-winning tech support, and free internet access, all for $28 a month. No mystery there. Call 1-800-GATEWAY for a Gateway Essential PC with an Intel Celeron processor.
Hi. Welcome to BBC America. The best of British television. All on one new channel. BBC America. A whole new world of programming. With a bit of something for everyone. Award-winning drama.
This country needs a change.
Movie premieres featuring Britain's brightest stars. World news and documentaries, in-depth and impartial. And Britcoms, irreverent, outrageous. BBC America. Completely British. Completely different. Explore a whole new world. Just contact your local cable or satellite provider. BBC America. Completely British. Completely different.
BBC Pete! It only takes a little idea to change the world. One good idea leads to another, and before long, you're only a couple of degrees away from greatness. TLC and host James Burke lead you on an irreverent tour of history. Find out how junior high kids, the guy under this sheet, and the gin and tonic saved the free world. While margarine, marching bands, and earthworms kept Hitler from building the bomb. It's all about connections, Monday through Wednesday on TLC. Adventures for your mind.
How can I keep her on the right path?
Does a guy my age really have to start thinking about his heart?
Low fat, low cal, low carbs. Which diet really works?
Help is on the way. From the people who bring you Discovery comes a revolutionary new TV channel and website dedicated to your health. Discovery Health Channel and discoveryhealth.com. Online July 1st, on TV this summer.
The ferry Estonia had mysteriously capsized and sunk on a stormy night in the Baltic Sea. With few clues and no eyewitnesses, a crack team of investigators had found out why, or so they thought. When the Commission's report was published, a firestorm of controversy erupted. Even though the ship lay in less than 300 feet of water and was easy to reach, the underwater survey was criticized as inadequate and incomplete.
This ship is hardly deep. I mean, and it could easily be given a proper survey, yet something or somebody or some organisation is stopping a proper survey. It seems an obvious thing to do.
Naval architects and other experts joined the survivors in denouncing the inquiry. The most damning comments came from a team of investigators called in by the German firm that built the ship. They rejected the idea that the bow design was at fault. The argument hinged on the bow door. Did it come off first and cause the disaster, as the Commission found? Or did it come off later when the ship was sinking, as they contend?
We believe that we can prove that the sequence of events which led to the sinking of this poor vessel has nothing to do with the flare of the bow.
The essence of the shipbuilder's argument is that the ferry was so poorly maintained it should never have been allowed to sail. This is a video of the bow door taken by a Swedish tourist on board the Estonia just days before the disaster. The German shipbuilders argue that the video shows a big gap in the hinge and some parts missing. And there is clear evidence that the hinge did not fit properly, making it difficult to close the bow door.
This has created this big gap here. And then you see here that the securing plate is missing completely. then the whole assembly...
As a result, German experts claim the whole hinge assembly was weak and misaligned. Eyewitnesses confirmed that the crew had problems shutting the bow door. The shipbuilders believe the crew had to hammer it shut and point to the footprints still visible on the door as proof. This is the scenario posited by the German shipbuilders. Just after 1 o'clock, the vessel was badly damaged. How? No one knows. But the German experts believe that the Estonia had a hole below the waterline on the starboard side, and that water poured in below the car deck. According to witnesses interviewed by German investigators, the ferry lurched suddenly 50 degrees to starboard, then slowly righted itself. The fact that the ship didn't sink then proves, according to the German experts, that the car deck could not have been full of water, or it would have sunk like a stone. The bow door, they believe, was damaged, but still intact. 8 minutes later, at 1:10, the Estonia slowly heels over to starboard again, this time to 90 degrees or more. Only later, at 1:20, does the bow door come off under the heavy pounding of the waves. Finally, at 1:30, half an hour after the start of the accident, the Estonia capsizes and sinks.
And then the rider fell off like this.
At stake are huge sums of money. If it's proven that the design of the bow doors was inherently flawed, then the German shipbuilders could be held liable. But if it's shown that the ferry company, partly owned by the Estonian government, was negligible, they may be found at fault. The disaster also raises questions about the whole system of licensing and operating ferries. The Estonia should never have been assigned the route it was on. It was neither designed nor certified for the open sea. Also in dispute is a videotape of the wreck. The German shipbuilders believe that a tape of the starboard side of the wreck would show the hole that caused the disaster. But the Estonian government contends no pictures were ever taken of the starboard side. In the heat of the argument, the Estonian chairman of the inquiry resigned. Recovering the ship could resolve the issue. But 3 weeks after the disaster, the three governments changed their mind about raising the ship and declared the Estonia a national grave which must not be disturbed. But the relatives of those who died are demanding that the ship be raised. For 2 years after the tragedy, an icebreaker was stationed over the wreck to prevent access. Despite protests from the relatives, pebbles and rocks have been poured around the wreck of the Estonia. The government's plan is to entomb the Estonia in a sarcophagus of metal and concrete in memory of those who lost their lives. If so, the cause of one of the world's worst maritime disasters will remain a mystery. The work of marine investigators goes on. Whether a ship is lost by an act of God or human error, only their dedication can prevent history from repeating itself.
It's It's the most complex transportation project ever attempted. It's 33 miles long and runs 300 feet below the English Channel. Now Science Frontiers exposes the Eurotunnel. Next on TLC, deep adventures for your mind at TLC.com.